There's a rather common saying amidst our teenagers. Maybe you've heard it before, maybe even some of the younger students. Tell me if you've heard this before. Mass is boring. Right. I'm sure you've heard that maybe once or twice. Maybe you've even said it yourself. I mean, let's be honest. If we were to go for a show of hands of who have ever in your life found Mass boring, every single one of us would probably raise our hands. At least the honest ones among us. I mean, let's be honest. There are times that I get bored in my own homilies. But we come and we recognize there must be something wrong then. Because if the church says that this is the high point, this is the source and summit of our faith, this is what it's all about, and we're finding it boring, then either there's something wrong with the Mass, or there's something wrong with the way we're experiencing it. Now, if you ask anybody, what's the problem with the Mass? You're going to get a whole bunch of different answers. Father, this is the problem with the Mass. The music is too loud. Oh, no, Father. The problem with the Mass is that the music is too quiet. No. The problem with the Mass, I'll tell you what the real problem with the Mass is. The real problem with the Mass is the homily is boring. No. Here's the real problem with the Mass. The real problem with the Mass is the priest moves around too much. No. The real problem with the Mass is the priest doesn't move around enough. He's always stuck behind that ambo. No. Here's the real problem with the Mass. The real problem with the Mass is it's way too long. No. The problem with the Mass is it's way too short. Problem with the Mass. We have all these problems with the Mass. But are these really the problems with the Mass? Almighty God says to us that He is going to be here. He speaks to us through His Word. He changes bread and wine into His very body and blood so that we can have union with Him. We come, and this is the high point of our lives. This past Christmas, I gave out the Resisting Happiness book by Matthew Kelly. He talks about how when he was growing up, he and his brothers would often try to get out of going to Mass. I'm sure any of you who are parents of teenagers have never experienced this before, but this is the way a typical conversation would go as one of the children would be propped forward to go and ask to get out of going to Mass. Dad, do we have to go to Mass today? No. You're joking, aren't you? No. But there's more to it, isn't there? Yes. What? You don't have to go to Mass if you can tell me the one thing that you're going to do while I am at church with your brothers that is more important than going to church and thanking God for another week of your life. Okay. It might take you a while to think about it. So while you're thinking about it, go and get dressed for church. Typical in the Kelly household. Do we approach Mass? Do we approach going to Mass with the right attitude? Because if we understood what the Mass is, there's no way that we could be bored with it. Matthew Kelly goes on to say that boredom is a manifestation of selfishness. And I'd never really thought about it this way before, but it can only occur when we're overly focused on ourselves, he says. It always means that we have set God and neighbor aside to focus exclusively on ourselves, and that is never a recipe for happiness. When we get bored, it means we're focused only on ourselves. Makes me rethink all the times when I've been bored in my life. So how do we change our focus? How do we allow this Mass not to be boring, but to be living and active? Well, there's a very simple way. And here's the truth. On this Epiphany, we hear about how God manifested Himself to the peoples. We have three different manifestations that we focus on the Epiphany. The first we hear about most clearly is in the Gospel, where the Magi come and they're following the star and Christ is manifested to the Gentiles. Second manifestation is at the baptism of the Lord, where the sky is rent open and the Spirit descends on him like a dove, and a voice comes from the heavens, "You are my beloved Son. In you I am well pleased." After the 8 o'clock Mass, one of the parents came up to me and said that their daughter thought that I sounded like the Wizard of Oz. And then the third manifestation is the first miracle Jesus does at Cana in Galilee when he turns water into wine. These signs, these manifestations of God, and we often might say, well, I wouldn't be bored at Mass if God manifested himself to me. Well, here's the truth. Here's the truth. God is manifesting himself to us constantly, but especially in the Mass. The question is, do we have ears to listen? Are we paying attention? I was at someone's house the other day, and I was playing a game, a rather intricate game that I was trying to figure out because it was the first time I've ever played. And when we were done the game, we noticed that one of the daughters had left. She had to go to work. And we were like, why didn't she say goodbye to us? Found out, she said goodbye to us 3 times. And we didn't even notice. Apparently, we even said goodbye back to her. And we didn't even notice. When we're so focused on things other than God, we don't hear God speaking. And God does speak to us. What type of father would God be if he never spoke to his children? Good fathers always speak to their children. And God speaks to us. Jesus says in the Gospel of John, I no longer call you servants, because a servant doesn't know what his master is doing. I have called you friends, because friend, I've told you everything that my Father is doing. God calls us his friends. He manifests himself to us. The question is, do we listen? So how do we do this? How do we make it so that we're listening for God? How do we make it so that Mass is no longer boring? It's when we're listening and hearing God speak to us. Matthew Kelly again speaks about what he calls a game changer, the Mass journal. He says, if everyone came to Mass with a journal and ready to write down what God spoke to them, you'd be listening. You'd be actively attentive. You know, lifelong learners are those who are ready to learn at any moment and want to make sure that they write things down. He talks about how he keeps a pen and paper by his bed at night in case he wakes up in the middle of the night and wants to write something down and he's afraid he'll forget. And so often that's the way I am. I know, I've got to make sure I send myself a text or write myself a note if I'm going to remember some moment of, at least what I consider, inspiration in the midst of my day. If we come to Mass expecting to hear God's voice, expecting for him to speak to our hearts, we'll hear him. We will hear him. So what do? You take any old journal, it doesn't matter, it could be a spiral ring bound, or it doesn't matter what it is. You write at the top of the page, God, show me one thing in this Mass that will help me to become a better version of myself this week. And then you listen. You listen to the music. You listen to the readings. You listen to the homily. You listen to the prayers. You listen to the silence. And you listen and say, God, speak to me. And when you find that one thing, not talking about 15 things, not talking about 100 things, the one thing that God speaks to you that day, you write it down. And then on Monday, you open up your Mass journal and say, what did God speak to me for this week? Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we open it up and again remind ourselves, what is God speaking to me this week? And God will change our lives when we start to listen for his voice. Doesn't matter how old or young we are, God will move. He loves to speak to us. Now, for those of you who are forgetful, for those of you who get that beautiful Mass journal and color it up and do all sorts of designs on it and then leave it on the counter before you leave, at the main entrance of the church, I put out a box and I put in a sign that says Mass journals. And I went to the dollar store and I bought a whole bunch of little journals, and there's a little thing of pens right next to it. So even if you forget on your way in, I got to grab my Mass journal, just don't then put it back with the notes. Make sure you bring that home so you can keep that note with you. And let God speak to you today, and next Sunday, and the following Sunday. And let God speak to your heart. I tell you, try this. If you find Mass boring, try this. Expect to hear God's voice as He manifests Himself to you. It will change your life.